Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. It looks like we have a few people still joining, so we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello, my name is Jessica Stenclift, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Accudata Systems. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar, GDPR, Why U.S.-Based Organizations Must Pay Attention Now. Before we get started this morning, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we will have a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat window in your browser. After the webinar, each attendee will receive a post-event email with both our full recorded webinar and a copy of the slides. Your hosts for today are Accudata Systems and ForcePoint. Headquartered in Houston, Texas, Accudata is a leader in IT consulting, cybersecurity, and systems integration. We help organizations solve their toughest IT challenges based on 3 core tenets: secure, modernize, and grow. ForcePoint is a global leader in cybersecurity solutions that is focused on understanding human behavior and intent to protect employees, business data, and IP. One important note I do want to make today is that the presentation does not represent nor is intended to offer legal advice. Should you have questions in that area, please seek your legal counsel. Today, we're joined by 2 extremely knowledgeable experts who are here to help you understand what the EU's General Data Protection Regulation is and how it will impact your business. First, I'd like to welcome Paul Kendall. Paul is a Governance, Risk, and Compliance Senior Consultant at Accudata, providing high-level consulting services to customers in the areas of IT security, regulatory compliance, and information security management. He has over 40 years of experience in the healthcare, financial services, and manufacturing industries. During his career, Paul has successfully built several information security programs from the ground up for both Fortune and global listed companies, as well as managed existing programs in the United States, United Kingdom, and France. We're also pleased to welcome Neil Sacker, Deputy CISO at ForcePoint. Neil holds 18 years of experience in the information security industry, with 10 years of financial services experience in the insurance and banking arena. Neil is a member of the ENISA Threat Landscape Stakeholder Group, where he contributes to the EU agency program alongside CERTs to position the threat landscape, offer mitigation advice, and threat analysis innovation. Neil is also co-founder of the Security Advisor Alliance, a not-for-profit organization formed to help security leaders in their role and offer advice and tools to move toward improved risk and data-centric strategies. So with that, thank you all again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Paul to get started.
Good morning, everyone. We've got 2 really good sessions this morning. In this session, I'm going to provide you with an introduction to the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. This will include a brief review of how it fits into the overall privacy-centric regulatory environment within the European Union. We will then look at who may be required to comply with GDPR, high-level compliance roadmap, and finally, the potential consequences for noncompliance. Let's kind of start with a definition. The General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is intended to strengthen and consolidate data protection requirements for all EU citizens, which the GDPR refers to as data subjects, regardless of the location of the data. It also addresses data export to and usage in countries outside the EU, such as the United States. How does GDPR affect the older Data Protection Directive? Although GDPR does not fundamentally change the intent of the 1995 Data Protection Directive, it does augment significantly the directive's requirements through the introduction of numerous new obligations to support the essential requirements under DPD. As a directive, the DPD set guidelines for all EU member states to follow, with each member state having the ability to interpret how the implementation was to be achieved. By establishing GDPR as a regulation, the EU Commission has created a single, unifying law that is immediately applicable and enforceable in all member states upon ratification, with member states able to define, to a limited degree, the inspection and sanction requirements of the regulation. This makes it a lot easier for EU citizens to understand their rights under the regulation and establishes a more unified approach for businesses who wish to deal with the EU. Why is this happening now? Why the new regulation when the Data Protection Directive was in effect already? The Data Protection Directive really allowed individual states to set their own requirements under the directive, which made compliance difficult, especially for smaller companies. That was remediated somewhat with the EU Safe Harbor Agreement for U.S. companies, which was implemented in 2000. But as many of you are aware, in October of 2013, the European Court of Justice declared the Safe Harbor Data Transfer Agreement invalid. This was based largely on revelations by Edward Snowden that the U.S. intelligence agencies were carrying out mass surveillance activities against EU citizens in violation of Safe Harbor rules. GDPR was approved by the EU Parliament on April 14, 2016, became effective about May 25th of that year. Enforcement of GDPR becomes effective 2 years after this date, making the enforcement date May 25th, 2018. The old Safe Harbor Agreement was replaced in July 2016 by the EU-US Privacy Shield. Privacy Shield requires the U.S. to more stringently monitor, enforce, and cooperate with European data protection authorities. It includes, for the first time, written commitments and assurance regarding access to data by public authorities within the U.S. One requirement of the Shield is an annual joint renewal review by both the EU and the U.S. This is conducted by the European Commission and the U.S. Department of Commerce, with input from various national intelligence experts in the U.S. and the EU. There's also a privacy summit with the non-governmental organizations and stakeholders on developments in the area of U.S. privacy law and its impact on Europeans. All this culminates in a final public report prepared by the Commission and presented to the Parliament and Council based on the annual joint review and other relevant sources of information. Given the EU's current skepticism of U.S. cybersecurity efforts to protect data held by U.S. companies and U.S. government's current commitment to cybersecurity, there is a growing concern that in the near future, this agreement may be decertified and compliance with GDPR would become mandatory at that point. At this point, I'm going to kind of take a brief break and ask you to take a little poll regarding your current status with GDPR. Essentially, have you begun planning? If you'll take about 30 seconds and respond to this, we will continue on down this road. Everybody, just a few more seconds to finish. And Okay, let's have a look at the results. Very good. Looks like a large percentage of you have really begun to start looking and planning for GDPR compliance. That's good. It's not a simple regulation to implement, and the further in advance you've begun your planning, the better it is in terms of being able to comply with the regulation once it goes into an enforcement phase. The next question is basically who qualifies? What organizations or companies would have to comply with GDPR? Essentially, GDPR applies to any organization that processes personal data of EU citizens, where the processing activities are related to things like offering of goods and services, irrespective of whether payment by the citizen is required, or monitoring of their behavior insofar as their behavior takes place within the European Union. So as long as their activities are in the EU, any monitoring of that behavior, such as the type of things that Facebook, Amazon, and Google would do, would certainly fall under the GDPR regulations. So what sort of records would they be looking at? Is this just electronic records, such as the type that Google maintains, or is it a lot broader than that? It's actually much broader than that. The regulation in part states that it applies to the automated and or non-automated processing of personal data, which form, quote, part of a filing system or are intended to form part of a filing system. Basically, this means that electronic and non-electronic information is covered by GDPR, whether it sits in an electronic database or a file cabinet in the corner of your office. So what type of organization do I fall under? GDPR defines two groups. They define something called data controllers, which is basically a person or organization that determines the purposes for which data is to be collected and processed and the way that it will be processed. They also define a second group known as data processors. This is a group or organization that, while it doesn't necessarily collect the data or determine how it's going to be processed, it does process data on behalf of a data controller in accordance with the data controller's instructions. So it is possible that if you are a data controller and you're doing your own processing, you certainly fall into both those categories. If you are a data processor and you've been processing this information in accordance with a controller's instructions and you decide, I've got all this data, maybe we should do some behavioral analytics on it, and that's outside the realm of what the controller has authorized, then all of a sudden you kind of cross over that threshold and you're no longer just a processor, you're considered a data controller because you've begun some original processing of that data which was not originally intended. Now, GDPR does establish several rights that data subjects have with regard to their personal data. These subjects' rights must be carefully considered since they do have the right to complain to higher authority within the EU and to seek judicial remedy. Whether you're a controller or a processor, you are potentially liable for any damages that could be assessed by the supervisory authorities or other judicial authorities that have jurisdiction in these cases. Briefly, the data subject's rights under GDPR have a right to fair processing, which means they are entitled to know what data is being processed, what the basis for that processing is, and who's doing the processing. Furthermore, it must be presented in a, quote, concise, transparent, and intelligible and easily accessible format using clear and plain language. They have a right of access. If they so request, data controllers must provide the data subjects with a copy of their personal data, the purposes for processing that data, the types of data being processed, and any third parties or types of third parties that will receive their data. Controllers must provide an easily accessible means for data subjects to make this request, and they must respond within 30 days of receipt of the request. Right to correction. Data subjects have the right to correct any incorrect information about them. One of the more important ones, the right to be forgotten. If data subjects withdraw consent for their data to be collected or used and request that that data be erased, then an effort must be undertaken to remove that data from the environment. Controllers must also pass this request on to anyone to whom they may have provided the data. This would include processors as well as any other third parties or public entities that may have received the data. Right to restrict processing. Along with the right to be forgotten, data subjects may specify limitations on how the data may be used. And as before, the information must be passed on to other entities that may have received the data. Right to data portability. Data subjects can request that the data be transferred to another controller. An easy way to think of this is if you have an AT&T cell phone and you go to Verizon, you can request AT&T to transfer all the data that they hold about you to the Verizon environment. Right to object. Data subjects can object to specific processing, things like direct marketing, processing for research purposes, or other types of processing. Finally, they have the right to what is called appropriate decision making, which is defined by GDPR as the right, quote, not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning them or otherwise significantly affects them. In other words, any decisions that are made on the basis of this, if they so request, should not be made in an automated process. Now, the requirements can vary somewhat based on the purpose for holding or processing that data. There are some exceptions, typically limited to higher level EU member states that are operating in the interest of national or EU security, or the pursuit of criminal justice cases by competent authorities. Use of PII for internal business functions related to human resources, healthcare, or some other highly stratified uses that have specific legal requirements are exempt from some aspects of GDPR. For example, the right to be forgotten. A good example of these would be patient treatment or human resource records that must be maintained according to law. Okay, if you've established that you are required to be compliant with GDPR, what do we have to do? First thing you've got to do is identify whether you're a controller or a processor or both. Look at the relevant obligations respective to that classification, and then make some decisions about what kind of PII you're holding and where does it exist. First, do you really need the information? If you don't need it, delete it. That's the easiest way to deal with the situation. If you do need it, do you have more than you need to be able to operate? How much of it could you delete, for example, and still be able to operate? Most importantly, where does it reside? As we all know, data can be anywhere. Data mapping is really crucial to understanding the location and flow of data. It can reside in legacy systems. It can reside in cloud data stores, private networks, even third-party applications like Office 365. It could be something as simple as spreadsheets, employee presentations, email threads, laptops, external devices. You can see this rapidly creates a very complex multidimensional landscape that has to be searched for data. Since they have the right to be forgotten or the right to have data transferred, data retention and instruction becomes very important as well. Data migration, where all do you send data? If you work in a cloud environment, do you have any control over where the data is physically stored? Physical storage of the data becomes very important under this. What are your current privacy notices? They probably have to be changed. The GDPR requires plain language, explicit consent, full disclosure, including specific data uses, redisclosure if uses change. If you decide you want to do something else with the data subjects do have to be notified and consent to that change in use. Who has access to the data? We all know access typically should be based on need to know, but what about other entities such as cloud providers? What access might they have to your data? What about managed service providers? Do they have any type of access? Finally, there are a couple of things that may need to be done depending on the size of the organization and the amount of data you collect. Do you need to have a data protection impact assessment performed? Typically, this is a risk assessment specific to the requirements for GDPR. Finally, if you're a large enough organization, you may need a data protection officer whose primary responsible for ensuring compliance with GDPR, and also as the focal point for any contact that EU data subjects may have with your organization. Once you've identified everything, you've got to protect it. Encryption is usually a really good way to do that, but of course, as we all know, managing encrypted data across multiple business processes is at best a problematic task. There should be very strict data usage controls and evaluation around data subjects' data. Monitoring and event management tools and methodologies definitely be deployed. Training and security awareness should be an ongoing task, whether you're having to comply with GDPR or not. Detection: if an organization suffers a loss of data, they must be able to quickly detect the breach and identify if personally identifiable information was stolen. Investigation should also attempt to identify source and destination of the breach, perhaps through using tools like DLP or data theft prevention that can provide some incident and event information. In addition, you may want to consider things like data classification, governance risk and compliance tools, e-discovery tools, mobile data management, and other types of tools to help you detect and identify information within the environment relating to a breach. Response: incident response is critical to protect sensitive and EU citizen data. In addition to mandatory breach notification requirements, you must also really have an effective incident response plan in place as well. As a reminder, you must report to the EU Supervisory Authorities within 72 hours of breach discovery. That's a very short window, and one that they will not take kindly to if you fail to comply. They will want to know in agonizing detail why you failed to comply within the 72 hours. Recovery: obviously, in the aftermath of a data breach, you must recover everything and try to continue on as normal. Ongoing communication with relevant authorities, whether it's the EU authorities or maintaining open lines of communication for EU citizens, asking about their data becomes critically important at this point. So what's at stake? What happens if I don't comply, or what happens if I'm found to be out of compliance? Well, the EU defined the penalties to be, quote, effective, proportionate, and dissuasive, unquote. The lower tier penalty, there are two levels of penalties, whether it's a violation of a principle or an administrative type rule. The lower is 2% of global revenue, or 10 million euros. As of about 10 o'clock today, that's $12 million US. There's an upper tier penalty for infractions in the more serious areas of basically double that, 4% of global revenue, or 20 million euros, which is about $24 million as of this morning. This would be in addition to any other fines or penalties assessed. By way of example, as we know, in 2013 and 2014, Yahoo had two of the bigger data breaches in history, effectively compromising 1 billion and 500 million accounts in both cases. It's still facing class action lawsuits from users over its failure to notify them. They discovered the breach in July, but only notified Verizon, who at that time was a potential buyer, in September. So they let 6 weeks to 2 months pass before they notified their potential buyer. In 2015, Yahoo's revenue was about 4.9 billion, meaning that if GDPR had been in effect, their fine at 4% would have been 198 million. By way of reference, Target recently settled its breach lawsuits for 39 million. So there was 198 million per breach. So for 2 breaches, total of $396 million. Since Verizon has purchased Yahoo, it now becomes the data controller, and it's therefore liable. If the breach had been under Verizon, based on revenues of $131.6 billion last year, 4% fine would have made it liable for $5.2 billion, which is about 500 million more than they paid for Yahoo. Fine structure can be additive. They can charge you for failure to report and for problems associated with the breach. In addition, individuals can sue for future or potential damages from a breach, even if they are not currently affected. A recent survey that was done by Pricewaterhouse of various industries showed that a majority of companies who have significant levels of EU citizen data believe that the EU will be very aggressive in levying fines and penalties and may start issuing fines as early as May 26, 2018, one day after enforcement goes into effect. Finally, in case you're wondering, there are 252 days remaining until GDPR enforcement. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Neil Thacker, who will discuss the EU perspective on GDPR.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for a great presentation covering GDPR in, 20 minutes. It's fantastic. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webcast. Thank you for giving up your time. One part of that 252-day countdown perhaps is, again, involved in spending your time listening to this webcast. As mentioned and introduced by Jessica, my name is Neil Thacker. I'm Deputy CISO at ForcePoint. You can probably tell by the accent that I'm a UK citizen. Currently, I qualify as an EU resident also, but in the near future, that will, of course, change. We actually had the new UK Data Protection Bill text also announced today. So today has a number of key milestones there. I've been following GDPR for a number of years. I actually followed the 2012 opinion piece, and when we actually had the outcome by the EU around that they were looking to redact the EU directive and replace with a regulation. I've had many discussions over the last few years with CISOs, both in the EU and the US, to ask how they're becoming prepared for GDPR. And so today I'm going to be talking about some of those discussions, some of those findings, and also some of the actions that we're taking at ForcePoint to also become ready for GDPR. So firstly, I want to talk about the impact and the very specific impact around it has a global and general impact. And many of you who are maybe soccer fans will also be familiar with this person here. Now, actually, quite interestingly, recently, Cristiano Ronaldo updated his bio within Twitter to reference his privacy policy around the collection and use of personal information. So I think this clearly highlights that it does affect everybody, even, again, highly paid professional soccer stars. In terms of the regulation, again, a great starting point really is to, of course, read the regulation. Now, it sounds like 70% of you have already started your program in terms of GDPR, and usually that requires you to go through and read the regulation. Probably one of the most important items to also sit down with your legal teams and perhaps even your governance, risk and compliance teams and understand what this regulation dictates. Paul has done a fantastic job of highlighting the majority of the key articles that come as part of this. But just to confirm, the regulation is 88 pages. It includes 173 recitals. It has 11 specific chapters and also 99 articles that relate to data protection. And again, it has a very specific impact to EU residents. So again, this applies to any organization that controls or processes EU personal data. And that's also by offering goods, services, or by profiling, again, EU residents. In terms of where to get started, or if you're starting this program, if you're in the 30% that has just started to look at GDPR, or if you're revisiting, you're in the 70%, a great place to start is with Article 5. Article 5 actually relates to the core principles of this new regulation. It goes into detail around how data has to be handled with obviously the law in mind, making sure that fairness and transparency is also applied. It also dictates some kind of key areas around purpose limitation. Something that, again, Paul also mentioned is that there is a specific, perhaps a specific notice period and consent given by the data subject. The data processing must meet that purpose. If additional purposes are required, then additional consent is also required. It also goes into detail around minimizing data and ensuring that data is limited and so that it can only be processed when necessary. And then as part of the Article 5, the principles, it also talks about accuracy. So keeping that data accurate to ensure that the integrity is also maintained. As we go through into more details around the principles, we start looking at areas around storage limitation, so that data is not indefinitely stored unless perhaps it's in public interest, scientific, or requires areas of historical research. There are a few exceptions in addition to those. But typically, again, most organizations are not going to be permitted to store that data indefinitely. Probably the most important article and principle in terms of this, in terms of a security professional's approach, is Article 5.1f, that talks clearly around applying appropriate security around that personal data and applying protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage using appropriate technical or organizational measures. Now, because the GDPR is an outcome-based regulation, it does not tell you what appropriate is, but is it appropriate to your data processing activities? And again, it will require you to demonstrate those technical or organizational measures. In discussions I'm having with most CISOs today, they are making sure they clearly document those technical and organizational measures and have evidence to prove that those controls are considered appropriate. In terms of the principles, again, it also references accountability, something that, again, both controller and processor will need to demonstrate compliance with these core principles and ensure that accountability is also maintained. So those are the core principles of GDPR, and again, a good starting point or revisiting point to really understand what you need to do next. So many organizations also start looking at these 6 core principles and looking at the overall impact. Perhaps how do you need to start a program, or how do you need to, if you're midway through your program today, how do you go through and perhaps start asking for additional budgets or start asking for additional resources to help you with this program? We of course know the impact of not being ready for GDPR. We realize, again, most organizations are becoming prepared for that mandatory data breach notification requirement. That is a very difficult requirement to meet, and it will require a number of people inside your organization, a number of key stakeholders, to become prepared and ready for reporting that breach. If you qualify and you need a DPO, then again, your DPO will also be involved as part of that. They will be the primary communication person from the organization to the supervisory authority. But of course, a number of other key members need to be involved. Your security operations team, perhaps again, your governance, risk and compliance team, your legal team may also need to be involved and part of that incident response team. Again, Paul has mentioned already the fines, the sanctions and date, but also there is for the worst offenders, for demonstrations of pure gross negligence, the EU can also issue a data processing termination, which prohibits your organization from processing any personal data in the near future. Now, for most organizations, I think that is pretty much, that'll pretty much end businesses if they are considered a data processor or data controller, but are not permitted to process personal data records. And then finally, again, for any person that suffered material or non-material damage, they can seek compensation from the controller or processor. Now, for most organizations, the way that they're positioning this is to start looking at, again, the total impact of this. And this is not just primary loss factors, we're also talking about secondary loss factors, as well as tertiary loss factors. All these things would need to be considered as part of your program. It is no wonder that most CEOs of organizations are already highlighting this as a top risk to their organization. It sits within most risk registers, corporate risk registers, clearly within the top 5, perhaps sometimes the top 10. Another area of focus is around how organizations and how security teams start working together to really understand how they've become ready for GDPR. Something that I have focused on is, again, putting GDPR central to all new discussions I have and bringing that also into existing discussions I'm having, also with our Executive Security Council, with our Security Steering Committee, and also looking at how it impacts other areas of the organization and their security function. Of course, we've seen a big shift in organizations moving to perhaps cloud-based services, but also undergoing, again, a clear, defined project plan to deliver those services. In most cases, having a discussion around GDPR at those early stages is quite critical, making sure that your data transfer agreements are in place for those cloud service providers, making sure those cloud service providers are also handling personal data appropriately. There's a number of key ISO standards that focus clearly on data processing and personal data processing, something that actually ForcePoint has complied with and has a certification that is on the ISO 27018 certification. Very clear in terms of its scope, in that we are acting as a data processor in the cloud. That's just one example. There are many other examples out there, but this is something that, again, to demonstrate that you are complying with this new regulation, it becomes quite critical. For many organizations, of course, working with their legal and HR teams, and also working with their governance, risk and compliance teams, but also looking to understand, again, risk management, making sure that risk is really understood across the organization, from the executives to the managers to the employees as well. One area as well is focused on threat prevention, detection and response. Now, most organizations are looking at, again, where typically they see data breaches occur from. Now, of course, we hear about the big data breaches where an external threat actor has been able to compromise an organization and steal information and leak that information. But of course, we also need to understand that a data breach caused by somebody, an employee in your organization, just simply sending an email to the wrong destination also qualifies as a data breach, and that is therefore more likely to occur to most organizations. Again, if an organization receives an email and they have no contract in place to process data on behalf of that organization, they will also be required to report that to the Supervisory Authorities. So with the mandatory data breach notification, we already expect that most breaches will relate to, again, an employee mistake, perhaps in some cases a type of compromised activity, perhaps credential theft, or also in some cases some malicious activity. This actually goes full circle, also going back into how you start architecting those systems and bringing in new types of controls and security services. Another area we're seeing focus on is what does good look like in terms of GDPR? And really, if you have a good data governance framework in place, if you have good data governance pervasive across the organization, then hopefully there's not much more to do in terms of becoming ready for GDPR. Many organizations already have perhaps a data governance team, and they're looking at this type of, again, organization chart around how they actually educate the employees across the organization, be it from a strategic perspective, focused on that security council, focus on the tactical, working with the security steering committee, and then of course focusing on the employees. At each stage, it is important to understand the metrics and measurements that need to be addressed. Typically with the Executive Security Council, it's all about representing business risk. From a tactical, perhaps a security steering committee, and from a data custodian perspective, it's all about accurate and timely monitoring and reporting of, again, data protection and data protection incidents. And of course, for employees, it's making sure that employee does not make that simple mistake. They are being educated, and where possible, they're being educated real time. This is quite important for most organizations as they start building their program going forward. So the next slide, actually, I'm going to ask a quick question. Who is currently leading your GDPR readiness program? If you can start answering now, I'll read out the answers as we go through. Is it your legal or your data protection officer? Is it your governance, risk and compliance or audit team? Is it a member of your information security team? It may be your CISO. Is it somebody within IT? It may be your CIO, or it may be somebody in IT, a senior architect. Or finally, is it a consultant or third party? So hopefully you've had now the chance to answer those questions. Let's go and see the results. Okay, we have a good split there across legal, information security, and IT. That's an interesting one because that's actually, again, in terms of leading programs, we're seeing a slight shift in terms of the most popular answer usually is your legal team, with information security following very closely in second place. So it's great that we see a very similar result here. So I want to go into a bit more detail around what is personal data. So we understand how we start forming this organization. The first questions typically asked is, well, again, what is in scope? What defines personal data? And something that we're actually seeing is that personal data is not just PII. It actually includes lots more information. I mean, it may also include things such as, in addition, national identifiers. So each country within the EU will have a separate list of national identifiers. It could be social numbers, it could be driving license numbers, it could be, again, health records. They may all have their own national identifiers that constitute personal data. We also have online identifiers. And with GDPR, we have a very specific, there's a specific recital 30, that talks about online identifiers, which includes things such as MAC addresses, IP addresses. All those also fall into scope of the GDPR. We also have discussions around what constitutes personal data processing. And actually, again, Paul mentioned this, the focus on, again, processing data for goods, services, or, again, profiling activity, but also what happens to that data around business intelligence, perhaps secondary use of personal data processing. And again, all of those things will need to be defined as part of your notice given, your privacy notices given to consumers, but also your own employees. There is a specific article that references employees as part of the data processing arrangement. Many organizations that I'm working with, and in addition to ForcePoint, we have a very clear data inventory that separate our business systems, our business processing systems that focus on our customers, our employee-based systems, again, systems which typically are used for HR and payroll, etc., that process employee information, and perhaps even in some cases for security vendors such as ForcePoint, a subscriber product data system list inventory that also goes into more of the product items that are collected by product and processed on behalf of the product team. So those are the kind of key categories that you need to be aware of. Again, most organizations, of course, it is those business systems and employee-based systems. So what happens going forward? We're already being issued guidance by the supervisory authorities, and there will be a supervisory authority for every EU member. In the UK, we have the ICO, who have been issuing guidance again for the last few years through that grace period that we're now in, that 2-year grace period to become ready for the regulation. They offer regular advice. They offered some good advice around 12 steps to take now. This was right at the beginning of that grace period. Most organizations are now past this and starting to look at, again, typically where the supervisory authority will be engaging with you as an organization going forward as a data processor. Something to also bear in mind is that the supervisory authorities will also already be issuing reports around data security incidents that they have identified over a period of time. The ICO is one example, regularly produces a report highlighting breach causality. And again, just to confirm this, just to set this in stone, the majority of those breaches are caused by accidental and very simple mistakes being made by organizations. Data being posted to the wrong destination, data being faxed in some cases to the wrong destination, data being sent by email, the failure to redact data using very simple anonymization, pseudonymization techniques. And again, we're seeing these are the most common issues that typically cause breaches. There's also discussions right now, again, showcasing and demonstrating you are putting in the appropriate security and appropriate controls. We focus heavily on who, what, where, and how, and making sure we have predetermined actions. So again, very simple examples. Of course, over time will become more complex, but these are the most simple examples that we can give. HR, for instance, handling personal data, perhaps in some cases, sending it to a business partner through Dropbox, through the web channel. We may not have a contract in place with Dropbox. We don't not see Dropbox within our personal data inventory. We will predetermine and block that activity. Tools that can do this, such as DLP, some UBA tools, CASB tools, etc., can also perform this type of activity, or they will just block. And of course, traditional web security gateway products can also do this. But of course, if the HR person now puts personal data, wants to send it through an email to a business partner, we may allow that type of activity, that communication, but we might want to ensure encryption is being used to protect the data. So again, understanding the context around the data delivery is important. Finally, perhaps somebody in the sales or marketing team has access to some customer records. Perhaps they've downloaded this from Salesforce, they've put it onto their laptop, they put it in a USB drive to copy that off the laptop that has appropriate security on. You may want to ask them to confirm and ask the reason of why they are now storing that data onto removable media. And again, you may then say, well, if the reason isn't adequate or doesn't meet the requirements of securing that data, you may then block that type of activity. So these, again, are very simple techniques. But again, in terms of the breach causality, we do realize that the most simple mistakes are being made that will lead to data breaches. So we also see organizations starting to focus on maturing their security strategies. So again, moving away just from focusing on the infrastructure. The previous slide I talked about the understanding the who, what, where, and how. At this stage, it's really understanding the what, and they're moving along their security strategy plan to be more focused on the risk and the data and human elements as part of that. And again, that also maps back to the governance pyramid, where again, executives are really asking for a more risk-based data processing type compliance checklist, and all those things being performed that require you to meet the obligation of the GDPR. So these are some examples where we're seeing most organizations moving away from just infrastructure and just compliance, because as I mentioned before, GDPR is an outcome-based regulation. So it's demonstrating good data processing. It doesn't always sit within a general compliance type strategy. We're now seeing it again more focused on threat and of course risk, and looking at these types of controls to become ready for GDPR. One area that we definitely start focusing on again is moving organizations where possible to that risk strategy. So again, it would be great to start a poll here to see where you are on that roadmap. Again, do you focus on infrastructure? Do you focus on compliance? Is your security program threat driven, or are you looking at risk, or is there something else? So again, if you can start voting, and we will close the poll in about 10 seconds as we go through into the next slides. Great. So it seems like, again, very few are just focused on infrastructure, on just compliance. And it's great that we see that some are on threat and also some are on the risk program and other. Again, please feel free to email me to tell me where else you're focusing on your security program. So how do we start addressing this in terms of that program? If we're focused on the data and human element, how do we start managing this? And again, it's an old term that has been used in information security for many years. It's all about the people, process, and technology. But for many organizations, they focus on a linear approach to this. For me, it's a cycle. Those that are familiar with the OODA loop realize that, again, once you start focusing on the controls and implementation of the controls, you have to go back to the start and reprocess. And again, this is the same for this type of cycle, the people, the process, the technology cycle. What we're asking for GDPR is that all people will follow an agreed business process, and that really 90% of effort should be made to align the technology to the process so that technology can enforce. And of course, this should be a continuous cycle. Where people step outside, away from that process, then that really should be your tactical approach. The strategic approach really should be to align technology to process to enforce. Tactical should be to adjust and educate employees around that behavior. And of course, if you're seeing other things outside of that, then typically it will be an exception or a security incident that requires monitoring. What we're seeing many organizations doing today is, again, leading up to that 25th of May 2018 enforced date, is testing this process, looking to see where they have some weaknesses across people, process, and technology also. Some great 3 steps you can start taking now, again, are going through and running an inventory, creating an inventory of personal data processing activities, looking at the applications that you have, looking at typically where the data is stored, if you're looking at cloud-based systems, if you have databases on premise, if you're communicating some of this data through email, if you have network storage and laptop devices or mobile devices, just ensuring you have a good record of where that data sits. Then secondary, moving on to managing and mapping data flows, understanding where data flows, understanding again if you have a contract in place for a processor to perform that type of activity. If that's a business process that has been agreed, then again, it's not an incident, it's something that has been agreed. For everything else, again, it should be identified. And then of course, finally testing your incident response plan, making sure you can test and you can respond within that 72 hours of identifying that incident. At Force Point, what we've done is we've focused on, of course, how technology can assist as a security vendor, as a technology provider. We have a number of papers that are available now that you can access. We have actually 3 core technology mapping guides focusing on that personal data inventory and the data flow mapping and control. And again, a brand new one that's just been released on incident response. And we also worked alongside Hunton & Williams, a leading law firm in the EU that has spent the last 4 or 5 years focused on the GDPR and trying to understand the key articles that are really relevant for security and privacy professionals. We have actually, this paper has been authored by Rosemary J, who's also one of the authors on what I consider one of the de facto books on GDPR, the Guide to GDPR, who also contributed to this paper. So again, you can access this paper from our website, forcepoint.com/GDPR. And for me, that's it. For again, for everyone that's in, I'm going to now hand back to Accudata to go through perhaps some questions and answers. Hopefully we can answer some of those questions. I'm going to hand back to Jessica. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Neil. We appreciate it. And Paul, thank you. As far as next steps, wanted to let everyone know that if you are really looking to, if you're looking to get started today, Paul and Neil have both offered several ideas on what to do first to get started. The other thing that we can offer is just an opportunity to sit down and discuss your strategy and how to start it from the ground up. Additionally, we do have several offerings at Accudata around GDPR specific to data privacy impact assessments, data privacy officer services if you don't have someone yet to run that part of your process, policy and process development, as well as ISO support and assessment. So at this point, we're going to take a couple questions. We just have a little bit of time left here on the webinar. So our first question is for Neil. What about backups? Are those within the scope of GDPR compliance?
Unfortunately, yes, they are. However, it's a really interesting question because it depends, of course, what you're backing up and, again, what you've had consent at that point in time to get it. For instance, if you are issued a right to erasure request, you always need to go through and remove that data. You may, in some cases, you may need to keep a backup because it may relate to perhaps a transaction that was performed. So you may also be able to contest and relate to legitimate interest. But in simple answer, yes, backups are also included as part of GDPR. They are in scope as part of it. So again, also understanding where that data sits as part of your backup and archiving systems is important.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The second question is, we see that there seems to be a differentiation between EU citizens and EU residents, but what is the difference?
Okay, yeah, I can take that one as an EU resident. So, yeah, GDPR is very specific in terms of that it relates to an EU resident. So you need to be residing, you need to have you need to be living at that point in time within the EU. You don't actually need to be an EU citizen for this regulation. So again, it focuses clearly on the EU resident itself. So now some people may actually be an EU citizen because they have resided in that country for a number of years. They have a passport, etc., an EU passport. But again, this relates to EU residents. Again, it's very specific to the location where you're based, where you're living at that point in time.
Great, thank you, Neil. And we'll take one more question for today. So I'll direct this one for Paul. So is being ISO 27001 compliant sufficient for supervisory authority, or is there a GDPR certification that I can get?
I think Paul may be on mute.
Maybe Paul. Neil, go ahead and take this one.
Okay,
yeah, I'm
sure.
sorry.
Go ahead, Paul. Over to you.
Oh, I was going to say, GDPR regulations are, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Neil, but as I've read them and begun to understand them quite a bit, they are very ISO 27001/2 centric, and really do follow pretty heavily the ISO standards around, recommendations in terms of what you should be doing from a security standpoint. While I don't think there's a specific certification, quote unquote, for GDPR at this point, of course there are ISO compliant certifications that you can get as well.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, again, from in terms of the controls around this, and again, they are very much ISO. However, again, having an ISO certificate, again, does not make you GDPR compliant. Actually, there is no such thing as GDPR compliance. There are a number of organizations also working around this and looking at how they can perhaps, in some cases, offer a shield system to actually help organizations understand where they have some gaps. And again, there has been discussions going forward that there may be something that can be put in place, an agreement put in place around a shield system. But again, I mean, ISO is a good starting point. Obviously, ISO is focused on a maturing security program. But of course, with GDPR, you have to become ready from enforcement date. So again, ISO isn't going to help you completely. So yeah, there's also benefits. I mentioned before ISO 27018 as one example. That's great for cloud service providers that are processing personal data. Again, if you are in that business, then again, that's a good recommendation. But again, still doesn't make you GDPR ready.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And we actually did have one more question come in. We'll go ahead and get that one answered. So directed toward Paul first, and then Neil again if you want to add something too. So when an employee asks to be forgotten, is it the company's responsibility to notify all third parties, i.e. cloud solution providers, to delete that data? And how does the organization who initially made that request of their solution provider ensure that that third party has actually complied?
Well, ensuring compliance, of course, is going to be difficult. The short answer is anybody that you have shared or any organization that you have shared that data subjects information with must be notified, and they should make, I believe, as GDPR calls it, reasonable efforts to ensure that data is removed from their systems. So there are cases where that may be extremely difficult, particularly if it's data that's been shared with any public entities. There may be cases where it may be very difficult to prove that that's been erased, but the originating or the data controller for that particular in that particular case should make a sincere effort or a reasonable effort to notify the people that it has shared data with and get assurance from them in some form, whether it's a certificate of erasure or kind of like a certificate of destruction for paper documents, that has in fact been done. In terms of going and actually visually inspecting their systems, that probably won't happen. So some sort of compliance affirmation from the companies would probably be your best solution for addressing that issue.
Yeah, and again, just to looking at the question again, it will be, if you're the employee of that organization, the organization itself will be the controller, and it will be their responsibility to notify any processes in terms of where your data is going. So yeah, from a cloud solution perspective. In terms of how that data is being removed, again, typically what we're seeing now is included within contracts. So when you're signing a contract for a data processing activity, there'll be very clear terms within that contract that also require you to erase that data to an acceptable level as well. So looking at, of course, things such as certain NIST standards around data erasure, etc., making sure that it has been completely erased, not just moved or deleted. So yeah, that's also another what we're seeing. Actually, we're seeing many contracts coming in already, obviously, of course, with GDPR terms, but also many questionnaires coming in every day around how organizations are becoming ready for GDPR. So that's a really important one in terms of that.
And I think, too, in the case of an employee, there will be some information that the organization itself does not have to remove. Anything that really relates to regulatory or, for example, taxing authorities that the company may be required to maintain for a certain period of time in order to comply with IRS rules or any other rules that are generated outside of the organization. Certainly, there's a legitimate case not to delete those for obvious reasons. The IRS won't look kindly at it if you do. So there are some exceptions to that rule.
Absolutely, and I would also strongly recommend, again, looking at where there are those overlaps. There are other regulations. There's also some new regulations coming in that also overlap in some areas of GDPR. So of course, going through, looking at all those activities and looking where you potentially may have an overlap, and again, you may not be allowed to erase that data in the first instance. So understanding that at that point in time is quite important. That also maps back into the inventory, making sure you have all of your destruction, also have your erasure notices within there also. That's a really helpful starting point.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for such a thorough answer. Well, with that, we're right at the top of the hour. We appreciate, Paul and Neil, you taking time to present and help clarify on GDPR. Thank you to our attendees. Just a reminder, you will receive a post-event email here shortly that will include the recording of the live webinar as well as the slides. Feel free to pass those on to your internal coworkers. If you have any questions at all about how to move forward with your GDPR compliance strategy, please feel free to respond directly to that email and we can help get you started. And hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye.